everyone, I'm Alice. Welcome back to another video. Today we are continuing in our series on verbal discrete questions, which are the questions in the verbal section that stand alone with sentences that you have to fill in the blank for. See the rest of the videos in this sequence in the card right there. Today we're going to be talking about double blank questions, and usually what they look like is something like this. You have a sentence, 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 a blank, and then the rest of the sentence that has a separate blank. Each of these sentences has 3 different answer choices that you can choose from, and you pick one choice for each blank for a total of 2 answers. These can be treated as separate questions because it'll be scored separately, but remember that because all of the ideas in the sentence or paragraph are aligned, the answer choice that you choose may give you an idea or help inform whatever answer choice is supposed to go in the other blank. For each of these videos, I'm also giving a key tip to keep in mind. For today, this is that you really want to make sure you read the whole paragraph for understanding, and you consider all the sentences together. In this example that we're looking at, you'll see really why that's so important. I also want to point out the different transition words that we went over in the last video, but here you can see we have a list of negative and positive transition words that give you an idea of how the ideas of a sentence or paragraph fit together. Anytime you see the words on the left, you can imagine that the ideas below and above it are going to clash or create a contrast, whereas for any of the words on the right, you will see those ideas align or support each other in some way. So let's see what that looks like in an actual example with a double blank. The question for today is this: it is blank that so many portrait paintings hang in art museums, since the subject matter seems to dictate a status closer to pictures in the family photograph album than to high art. But perhaps it is the artistic skill with which the portraits are painted that blank their presence in art museums. So a few things to note before we look at the answer choices is that this is pointed out in the very beginning: portrait paintings that hang in art museums. This is the main subject of the full paragraph, so we want to keep in mind that these portraits hang in art museums. And then we see our first transition word, which is since. Since is one of those positive transition words that indicates there's agreement or support between ideas. So we have the portrait paintings hanging in art museums and the subject matter dictating a status closer to pictures in the family photograph album than to high art. So the portrait paintings hang in art museums, and they also seem to have a status closer to pictures in a family photograph album rather than the high art that you might normally see in art museums. So notice that even though there is a contrast between the ideas themselves, the sentence is telling us that portrait paintings both hang in art museums and also have a status closer to pictures in a family photograph album. So don't get confused by the quote-unquote positive transition word that I have there. For the second sentence, we have another transition word saying but, perhaps. Here, this is creating a contrast between what's said in the first sentence and what's said in the second sentence. So in the second sentence, we're pointing out this artistic skill that the portrait paintings seem to have. The main idea here is that we have a big contrast between museums and family albums, and we have this sort of curiosity in the beginning. So we say that portrait paintings hang in art museums, but their status seems to not align with that. And then we have a sort of attempted explanation in the second sentence saying, but perhaps it's the artistic skill. So that gives us a good insight into the kind of word that we're looking to fill those blanks. For the first answer choices, we have surprising, understandable, and irrelevant. For the second one, we have challenges, justifies, and changes. Let's take this blank by blank so that it's not too overwhelming. So for the first blank, let's look at this sentence again. So remember, we're looking at portrait paintings hanging in art museums and also a subject matter that seems to be closer to a family photograph album. Even though both of these things are describing these portrait paintings, we can see that they are sort of contrasting, right? We would expect these portraits to be in a family album, but we actually see them in art museums. We're looking for a word that can really highlight that contrast. If we look at A, surprising, that actually fits here because if we have the portrait paintings, it is surprising that we see them in art museums, even though they might fit better in a family photograph album. For choice B, this is the total opposite idea because something that's understandable is something that makes a lot of sense and it's very natural. Here, because of that contrast between the portraits being in art museums and their seeming status, that doesn't fit here. Looking at choice C, irrelevant, this is probably the worst option here because something that's irrelevant doesn't matter. It's something that we really don't need to talk about at all. And here, even though we might not in everyday life care about these portrait paintings in art museums, this paragraph is talking solely about this topic, and there's no indication that any of the information is useless or totally unnecessary. As we can see, the correct answer for blank A is surprising because it sort of creates this curiosity. It says, why are these portrait paintings in art museums even though it seems like they shouldn't be? And let's look at the second blank with challenges, justifies, and changes. So let's read the sentence again. It says, but perhaps it is the artistic skill with which the portraits are painted that blank their presence in art museums. There are a few things that are pretty telling here. The first one is but perhaps. We talked about this being a transition word, creating a contrast between the first and second sentences, but it also is something that helps in justifying an idea or giving an explanation of some sort. We have this contrast of the art museum but the weird status in the first sentence, and then we have the second sentence talking about this artistic skill and talking about the presence of these portraits in art museums. In a sense, this transition word or transition phrase, but perhaps, is offering some sort of explanation for it. And because of that, you can see option E, justifies, is probably the best answer here. But I'll go through the other options as well. The first one is challenges. So artistic skill challenges the portrait's presence in art museums. This doesn't really make sense because the idea is that in art museums, you have art that is very skilled. It's a way to show off this artistic skill. Challenges is saying the artistic skill makes it so that the portraits shouldn't be in art museums. And logically, that just doesn't make sense. And it goes against what was discussed in the previous sentence as well. For the other option, changes, this just doesn't really make sense overall because there's no change in the artistic skill, there's no change in the presence of portraits in art museums, and there's no indication of any sort of difference over time or anything that suggests a change. So here it's really just making sure that the sentences don't really mention that idea at all. Just like choice C, irrelevant, wasn't mentioned in this paragraph either. For blank 2, the correct answer is justifies. Let's take a look at the full context of the sentence just to make sure that everything fits well. It is surprising that so many portrait paintings hang in art museums, since the subject matter seems to dictate a status closer to pictures in the family photograph album than to high art. But perhaps it is the skill with which the portraits are painted that justifies their presence in art museums. That makes a lot of sense. The first sentence is saying, why are these portraits in art museums if their status is closer to just random pictures that people would take? Well, second sentence says, the reasoning is probably the artistic skill that is shown in actually painting the portraits. Going back and reading also helps you make sure that your answer choices are correct. So just to recap, you want to keep in mind that the whole paragraph should be read to be understood. Make sure that you're considering all the sentences together so that you understand the full picture of the paragraph if you have double blanks like this. I would highly recommend that you take a good look at these different transition words, particularly if you have never really seen them in this type of context before. If you're looking for more information on how you can actually implement these tips and tricks into getting a better score on your GRE, please visit AliceChenGRE.com. I have more information about what it's like to work with me. For example, that I was patient and kind, I explained things to Sarah thoroughly and offered examples and tips. With Joshua, I gave him a better understanding of what he should work on to get over that 150 score that he was aiming for. I have more information about how private GRE tutoring works with me. For example, you can choose between writing, quantitative, and/or the verbal section. I will give you a customized study plan with session agendas for each time we meet. I can provide sample questions, different study resources, do a content review, go over strategies and examples with you, and as always, I offer flexible payment and scheduling options. Thanks so much for watching.